Hey folks, tonight we're settling in for something rather special. A story about power, ambition, and a boy who became king before he'd even finished growing. I'd like you to get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights if you're listening in the evening. Do let me know in the comments where you're listening from and whether you've got a particular era of history that makes your heart race. Mine's always been the Tudors, all that blood, all that scheming, all that sheer human messiness disguised as destiny. Now then, let's talk about breathless tension of Hampton Court Palace in October of 1537. It's a bit like a pressure cooker, really. Henry VIII, a man who was, to put it politely, not exactly known for his patient or stable temperament, had been waiting for a legitimate son for what must have felt like several lifetimes. He'd broken with Rome, upended the social fabric of England, and sent a couple of wives to the metaphorical and literal chopping block, all for the sake of a male heir. And then, finally, out popped Edward. The relief was so thick you could have spread it on toast. Te Deums were sung, bonfires were lit, and people probably got much drunker than was strictly necessary. But for the infant at the centre of this storm, life was less about being a baby and more about being a fragile, holy relic. From the very second he drew breath, Edward was less a person and more a political insurance policy. His father, terrified that a stray sneeze or a drafty window might snuff out the Tudor line, turned the nursery into a fortress. I often wonder if Edward ever felt the weight of those expectations before he could even talk. He was the precious jewel. That's what they called him. Imagine being a toddler and having grown men, dukes and earls, bowing to your high chair. It's enough to give anyone a bit of a complex, isn't it? He lived in a sort of gilded cage, surrounded by rockers and lady mistresses, who were strictly forbidden from letting any vile person near the prince. They literally scrubbed the walls of his rooms with soap and water every single day. In an age where most people thought a bath was a dangerous flirtation with pneumonia, that's saying something. It was an obsession with purity that, ironically, probably didn't do much for his immune system in the long run. He was a bright little spark, though. No doubt about that. By the time most of us were struggling with basic addition, Edward was tackling Greek and Latin with a ferocity that was frankly a bit intimidating. His tutors, men like Richard Cox and John Check, weren't just teaching him verbs, they were moulding a Protestant messiah. They fed him a diet of intellectual rigour and religious fire. There's this lovely, slightly sad image of him sitting at a tiny desk, his legs probably dangling, translating long passages of scripture while his father roared through the corridors elsewhere. Henry, of course, was the sun around which everything orbited, but for Edward, the sun was often distant, scorching, and prone to eclipses. He didn't see his father that often. When he did, it was all ceremony and your grace. Not exactly the kind of dad who's going to kick a ball about in the garden, was he? I suspect Edward's early years were remarkably quiet, despite the pageantry. He was a solitary child in a crowded room. You see it in the portraits, those eyes. They aren't the eyes of a carefree boy. They're the eyes of someone who knows everyone is watching him, waiting for him to either save the kingdom or die trying. It's funny. We often think of the Tudors as this robust, larger-than-life dynasty, but it was actually hanging by a single, very thin thread. And that thread was a small boy with a penchant for books and a recurring cough. The palace staff must have been terrified. Can you imagine being the poor soul responsible for tasting his food? Every time the lad had a runny nose, a dozen physicians probably had a collective nervous breakdown. It wasn't just health either. It was the psychological pressure of being the perfect prince. He had to be more virtuous, more learned and more royal than anyone else. There's a story, likely apocryphal, but telling nonetheless, that Edward once tore a living bird apart in a fit of pique. Some historians point to it as a sign of latent Tudor cruelty, a chip off the old block, so to speak. But I tend to think that if it happened, it was the lashing out of a child who had no control over his own life. Everything was scheduled. Every interaction was monitored. He was a miniature adult before he'd even lost his milk teeth. And then there was Jane Seymour, his mother. Or rather, the memory of her. She died just 12 days after he was born, which is a tragedy by any standard. But in the Tudor court, it meant she was instantly canonised as the perfect queen. Edward grew up in the shadow of a ghost who could do no wrong. His father's subsequent wives, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr were like passing ships. Some were kind, some were... Well, Catherine Howard was a bit of a disaster, wasn't she? But none of them could fill that Jane Seymour-shaped hole. I suspect this lack of a stable maternal figure made him turn inward. He became a boy of lists and ledgers. He loved maps. He loved fortifications. He liked things that were orderly and logical, perhaps because his own existence was so inherently precarious. He was the pivot point of the English Reformation, a pawn in a game played by giants, and yet, in his own mind, he was becoming the player. As we move through his story, you'll see this transition. From the coddled jewel to the cold, focused young man who believed he was God's lieutenant on earth. It's a bit chilling, really, how quickly a child can lose their innocence when they're told they own the world. He was 1537's version of a child star, but with the power to sign death warrants. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's stay here for a moment, in those quiet, scrubbed hallways of Ashridge or Hatfield, where the young prince is practicing his penmanship. He writes in a clear, precise hand. No mess, no fuss. It's the handwriting of someone who wants to be in control. Outside, the world is changing. Henry is aging, becoming a bloated, ulcerated shadow of his former self. The vultures are starting to circle. They're looking at that little boy at the desk, and they aren't seeing a child. They're seeing a way to get rich, a way to gain power, or a way to burn their enemies at the stake. It's a heavy burden for a 10-year-old to know that the moment your father's heart stops, you become the most important, and perhaps the most endangered person in the realm. Edward was ready, or at least he thought he was. But the reality of the crown is never quite what the tutors promise in the classroom. It's heavier, colder, and it never quite fits a child's head. It's a bit of a cliché to say he had daddy issues, but honestly, how could he not? When your father is essentially a walking volcano in a velvet doublet, you don't just grow up, you survive. Henry VIII was, well, he was a lot. By the time Edward was old enough to actually recognise the man, Henry was this gargantuan, pained figure, reeking of antiseptic and old meat, his leg weeping from an ulcer that wouldn't heal. Imagine being a small, neat, tidy-minded boy and having that loom over you. It's no wonder Edward became a bit of a stoic. You'd have to be, wouldn't you? If you showed too much emotion, you might get caught in the blast radius of one of the king's famous rages. Think about the sheer psychological noise of being the heir to a man who'd killed 2 of his wives. It's the sort of thing that sits in the back of your mind, a quiet little hum of don't mess up. Henry didn't just want a son. He wanted a continuation of his own ego. He wanted a warrior, a hunter, a man-mountain. And what did he get? He got Edward, a boy who'd rather read a treatise on the nature of the Eucharist than go out and kill a deer. Actually, Edward did go hunting, but he did it with the same clinical precision he applied to his Latin verbs. He wasn't doing it for the thrill. He was doing it because it was on the how to be a king checklist. There's this one moment, I think it was around 1541, where Henry comes to visit. The king is in a rare good mood, probably because he'd just married Catherine Howard, who was, let's be honest, a teenager herself. He looks at Edward and sees his own immortality. But Edward? He's looking at a father who is more a monument than a parent. There was no, tell me about your day, son. It was more, tell me what you've learned of the fortifications at Calais. It's exhausting just thinking about it. And the expectations. God, the expectations were enough to crush a grown man. Henry had spent 40 years turning England upside down, and he expected this child to just pick up the baton and keep running at a sprint. I wonder if Edward felt a bit of a fraud. Kids do that, don't they? They feel like they're wearing their parents' clothes. But for Edward, the clothes were a kingdom that was virtually bankrupt, and a church that was half reformed and screaming for direction. There was this constant tension between the old religion, the incense, the Latin, the comfort of the saints, and the new learning that his tutors were whispering in his ear. Henry was the one who broke the door down, but he still liked the old rituals. He was a confusing mix of a heretic and a traditionalist. Edward, however, was a purist. Maybe that was his way of rebelling. You can't outpower a man like Henry, but you can certainly outpiety him. And let's talk about the men in black, the tutors. Richard Cox, for instance. He was a man who probably didn't know how to smile. He saw Edward as a vessel to be filled with the true faith. So, you've got this kid whose father is a literal tyrant and whose teachers are religious radicals. It's like being raised by a combination of a hurricane and a textbook. Where's the fun? Where's the, I don't know, the dirt under the fingernails? Oh wait, I forgot. The walls were scrubbed with soap every day. God forbid he should touch actual earth. Do you ever get that feeling that you're being watched? Not just by one person, but by history itself? Edward must have lived with that every single day. Every bowel movement was recorded. Every meal was scrutinised. If he looked a bit pale, it was a national crisis. It's a miracle he didn't turn into a complete basket case. Instead, he turned into a bit of a cold fish. He learned to mask everything. You look at the later sketches of him, the ones by Holbein's followers, and there's this blankness. It's not that there's nothing there, it's that he's decided he isn't going to let you see it. I found it fascinating how we project onto him. To the Protestants, he was the new Josiah. To the Catholics, he was a poor, brainwashed child. But who was he when the candles were blown out? Probably just a boy who was quite lonely and a bit scared of his dad. I mean, wouldn't you be? There was this one time, and this is a bit of a tangent, but bear with me, when Edward was given a set of toy soldiers. Most kids would have played war, right? Edward apparently spent hours organising them into perfect formations according to the latest military theories from the continent. He wasn't playing, he was studying. It's that obsessive, compulsive streak that runs through the Tudors. They don't just do things, they master them, or they die trying. Anyway, as Henry's health started to really go south in the mid-1540s, the atmosphere around Edward shifted. It got darker, grittier. The men around him, the Seymours, the Dudleys, started looking at him differently. They weren't looking at a prince anymore, they were looking at a meal ticket. And Edward, sharp as a tack, probably noticed. He was 9 years old and he knew that his father was dying. He also knew that the second the old man breathed his last, he'd be the most powerful person in England, and also the most vulnerable. It's a weird thing, to wait for your father to die so you can finally start your life, only to realise that your life is going to be owned by a bunch of bickering uncles. I suppose it's a bit like being the lead singer in a band where the manager is taking 90% of the profits and telling you what to wear. Only in this case, if you mess up the lyrics, you might end up in the Tower of London. I think about that last Christmas Henry and Edward spent together. 1546. Henry was so ill he had to be carried in a chair, the tram they called it. The festive spirit was probably a bit thin on the ground. Happy Christmas, son. Here's a bankrupt treasury and a looming civil war. Don't lose the crown on your way to bed. It's grim, but that was the reality. The shadow of the father wasn't just a metaphor, it was a physical, suffocating presence. And when that shadow finally lifted, it didn't bring sunlight. It just brought a different kind of cold. Actually, and this is purely me speculating, if Edward felt a secret sense of relief when he heard the news, is that too dark? Probably. But when you've been living under a volcano, a bit of silence must feel like a symphony. Of course, he couldn't show it. He had to be the grieving son. He had to play the part. He was always playing a part. So, we really have to talk about the mothers, or the lack thereof. It's a bit of a mess, really. You've got Edward, this motherless child, and then this revolving door of women walking through the palace, each one with a different agenda, a different vibe, and frankly a different level of survival instinct. It's like a 16th century version of a reality show, but with more beheadings and better lace. Jane Seymour, his biological mother, was just, well, she was a portrait on the wall, a ghost. Everyone told him she was the purest of the lot, which is a hell of a thing to live up to when you're 5, and you've just spilled ink on your tunic. Then comes Anne of Cleves. Now history has been a bit mean to her, calling her the Flanders mare and all that nonsense, which, by the way, Henry likely invented because he was having a bit of a midlife crisis and she wasn't his type. But for Edward, she was actually quite kind. She sent him gifts. She was stable. But then, poof, she's gone. Pensioned off because Henry's eyes had wandered to Catherine Howard. And God, Catherine Howard. She was what, 17? 19? She was basically a teenager herself, trying to mother a very serious, very intense little boy, while she was busy flirting with courtiers behind the tapestry. It's a bit tragic when you think about it. Edward was probably more mature than his stepmother. And then, well, we know how that ended. One morning she's there, the next she's being hauled off to the Tower screaming. I wonder if anyone explained that to him. Sorry, Edward, your new mummy has been arrested for treason. Back to your Greek verbs, there's a good lad. It's that kind of abruptness that does things to a child's head. You learn not to get too attached. You learn that people, especially women, are temporary. They're like pieces of furniture that get moved around by the king's whim, except for Catherine Parr. Now, she was the real deal. She was the one who actually sat him down and talked to him like a human being. She was a scholar, a reformer, and she had this way of bringing the family together. She even got his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, into the fold. For a few years there, it almost looked like a normal family. Well, as normal as you can be when your dad is a homicidal monarch who's currently at war with France just for the sake of his ego. But even with Parr, there was this undercurrent of friction. She was a radical Protestant at heart, and she was feeding those ideas to Edward. She was subtly, or maybe not so subtly, steering him away from the old ways. Imagine them sitting in a sunlit room, Edward's little hand in hers, as they read prohibited texts. It was dangerous. She almost got herself arrested for it, you know. Henry nearly had her sent to the Tower too. Edward must have seen the fear in her eyes. He must have realised that even the Queen, even the woman who tucked him in, was only one bad mood away from the axe. It makes you a bit cold, a bit guarded. And then there's the sister situation. Mary was old enough to be his mother, and she was a staunch Catholic. Elizabeth was the clever, sharp-tongued one closer to his age. They're all living in this weird, competitive bubble. Who does Daddy love most today? Who's the most legitimate? Edward was always at the top of the pile, but he knew they were there, waiting in the wings. It's like being the lead singer of a band where the backup vocalists are constantly checking your pulse to see if they can take the mic. What about the dinner parties? Can you imagine? Henry at the head of the table, sweating and groaning, Catherine Parr trying to keep the conversation polite, Mary fuming about the new prayer books, and Edward just observing. He was a great observer. He started keeping a diary. Well, his famous journal, and it's remarkably dry. He records the most momentous things with the same detachment he uses for the weather. Today, my uncle was beheaded. It's a bit, keep calm and carry on, before that was even a thing. People say he was heartless, but I think he was just buffered. If you don't let the world in, it can't hurt you when it changes. And it always changed. That's the thing about the Tudor court. It's like walking on a frozen lake that's constantly cracking. You find a bit of solid ground, a stepmother you like, a tutor you trust, and then crack, the ice shifts. By the time he was 8 or 9, Edward had seen more political drama than most people see in a lifetime. He saw the fall of Thomas Cromwell, the rise and fall of various factions, the constant whispering in the galleries. He learned that words are weapons. He learned that silence is often safer. I read somewhere, and I can't remember where, that Edward once asked why his sisters couldn't just agree with him on religion. It's such a kid question, isn't it? Why can't we all just play the same game? But in the 1540s, the game was literally life or death. If you believe the wrong thing about a piece of bread, you end up on a pile of faggots in Smithfield. Edward took that very seriously. He wasn't just a boy king-to-be. He was a little theologian. Actually, let's talk about the little theologian bit for a second. It's easy to think he was just brainwashed by Parr and his tutors. But he was genuinely brilliant. He wasn't just parroting things. He was arguing, he was debating. He had this terrifyingly logical mind. It's almost as if, because his emotional world was so chaotic, with the disappearing mothers and the terrifying father, he latched onto the logic of the new religion as a way to make sense of the universe. God was the only father who wouldn't die or get angry at him for no reason. But back to the women. When Henry finally bit the dust in 1547, Catherine Parr was pushed aside pretty quickly. She married Thomas Seymour, Edward's fun uncle, and then she died in childbirth about a year later. Another mother figure gone, another person Edward cared about, erased. It's a recurring theme. Just when he finds a connection, the world snatches it away. By the age of 10, he was a king, he was an orphan, and he was surrounded by men who looked at him and saw a crown, not a boy. It's no wonder he was a bit of a dry stick. If you'd been through that many stepmothers and seen that much blood, you'd probably be a bit detached too. You stop looking for a mother and you start looking for a way to survive the people who are left. He was the son of a man who broke everything he touched, and Edward was left to try and glue the pieces back together while the glue was still wet and everyone was shouting at him. But hey, that's royalty for you. It's not all banquets and velvet. Mostly it's just being very lonely in a very large room and wondering if the person bringing you your wine actually wants you to wake up tomorrow. The morning it happened, the morning he became king, wasn't some grand cinematic sunrise. It was January 1547, and London was a grey, freezing sludge. Henry was dead. Finally. The old lion was gone, and for 3 days they didn't even tell the public. Can you imagine the smell in that room? Anyway, Edward was at Ashridge, and they brought him to Enfield to meet his sister Elizabeth. They were told together. They both burst into tears, which is, well, it's one of the few times we see him actually acting like a child. They stood there, two orphans clinging to each other in this drafty hall. But the crying didn't last long. It couldn't. The vultures were already mid-flight. Edward was 9. 9 years old. I mean, think about what you were doing at 9. Probably trying not to lose your coat at school or obsessing over a comic book. Edward was being told he was now the supreme head of the Church of England and the owner of every soul from Cornwall to Berwick-upon-Tweed. They whisked him off to the Tower of London, not as a prisoner, but as a king in waiting. And this is where the friction starts. His father's will had set up a council of regency. It was supposed to be a democracy of 16 men. But humans don't really do group sharing when there's a throne involved, do they? His uncle, Edward Seymour, soon to be the Duke of Somerset, basically did a velvet-gloved coup. He elbowed everyone else out of the way and declared himself Lord Protector. He was the good Duke, or so the propaganda said. He was going to look after the boy and the realm. But you could see the dynamic shift instantly. Edward went from being a pampered prince to being a political prop. He was the signature at the bottom of the page. He was the face on the coin. But the actual power, that was in Somerset's pocket. There's this weird, jarring contrast during the coronation. You have this tiny boy. He was quite small for his age, actually, weighted down by these massive, heavy robes. They had to cut them down so he wouldn't trip over and look like a fool. He's sitting on the throne in Westminster Abbey, and the crown is literally wobbling on his head. It weighed about 7 pounds. Think about that. A 7-pound weight on a 9-year-old's neck for hours. It's a miracle he didn't end up with permanent cervical damage. But he sat there, stone-faced, doing the king thing. What was going through his head when they did the anointing? It's a holy moment, right? But he was already a bit of a skeptic about the magic of the old church. He probably thought the oil was a bit messy and the singing was a bit long, but he played the part. He always played the part. And then, the banquets. Mountains of food he probably wasn't allowed to eat because his doctors were worried about his digestion. It's the ultimate look but don't touch scenario. You own the kitchen, but you're on a diet of broth and watered-down ale. And then there were the vultures. Not just Somerset, but the whole court. Everyone wanted a piece of the new Josiah. They'd approach him in the corridors, trying to slip him petitions or whisper a word in his ear about some land they wanted, or an enemy they wanted squashed. Somerset tried to stop this. He basically turned Edward into a prisoner in his own palace. He limited who could see him. He even controlled his pocket money. Can you believe that? The King of England had to beg his uncle for a few shillings to give to his servants. It's humiliating. Actually, there's a story that Edward started hiding notes. He was already a little spy in his own house. He'd write down who was being mean to him and who was being nice. He was building a mental dossier. He knew Somerset was overstepping. Somerset was out there building Somerset House in London, which, by the way, is still there, though not the original building, using stones from demolished churches. He was being flashy and arrogant, and Edward, this quiet, observant boy, was watching the money disappear. He was watching his uncle act like the king. Edward realised that being king was a job, but he wasn't being allowed to do the work. He was the CEO who wasn't allowed to see the spreadsheets. So what did he do? He leaned into his studies even harder. If he couldn't rule the people yet, he would rule his books. He'd master the theology. He'd master the languages. He was preparing. It's like he was a coiled spring. There was this one incident with his other uncle, Thomas Seymour. Thomas was the fun one, the handsome one, the one who married Catherine Parr, the stepmother, remember? Keep up. Thomas tried to bypass Somerset by sneaking into the king's bedchamber and giving him extra pocket money. He even gave him a dog. He was trying to buy the kid's love to get political leverage. It was a mess. A family feud played out in the private quarters of a 9-year-old boy. Thomas eventually tried to kidnap Edward, literally tried to break into his room at night. Edward's pet dog barked. Thomas shot the dog, which honestly, what a villain move, and the whole thing fell apart. Imagine that. You're 10 years old, you're asleep, and your uncle is at the door with a pistol, killing your dog. That's the security of the Tudor court. It teaches you a very specific lesson. Don't trust anyone. Not your uncles, not your protectors, nobody. It turns you into a very specific kind of person. A person who is always looking for the exit. A person who values cold, hard facts over loyalty. Somerset eventually had his own brother Thomas executed for that little stunt. And Edward? He signed the warrant, or at least he allowed it to happen. He wrote in his diary about it with all the emotion of someone describing a change in the price of wool. The Lord Admiral was beheaded. That's it. No, I'll miss my fun uncle, no. Why is my family so murderous? Just a statement of fact. It's this emotional deadening that really gets me. People call it Tudor steel, but I think it's just a survival mechanism. If you feel too much, you break. And Edward couldn't afford to break. He was the only thing standing between England and a massive bloody civil war between his sisters. Or at least, that's what he was told. The weight of the world was on those small 9-year-old shoulders, and the crown was still wobbling. It's enough to make anyone a bit of a cold fish. Right, so, Uncle Somerset? The protector. What a piece of work he was. He wasn't just content with running the country. He wanted to be the country. You ever met someone who thinks they're the smartest person in the room, but they're actually just the loudest? That was Edward Seymour. He took this young, impressionable king, his own nephew for heaven's sake, and treated him like a bit of background noise. He was basically a human shield for Somerset's own ambition. Somerset was a social reformer, which sounds lovely on paper, doesn't it? He wanted to stop enclosures. That's when the big landowners fenced off common land and left the poor to starve, but he did it with the grace of a runaway cart. He was also a man of massive, towering hypocrisy. He'd lecture the poor on modesty while building himself this gargantuan palace in the Strand. I mentioned it before, Somerset House. He literally blew up part of a church to get the stone. Imagine being the young king, who is being taught that every penny belongs to the state, watching your uncle use the royal treasury as a personal piggy bank. It's the kind of thing that creates a very specific type of resentment. It's a slow burn anger. Somerset was so paranoid about Edward being influenced by anyone else that he basically put the boy under house arrest. He controlled the guest list, the mail, everything. He even made Edward feel guilty for his own existence. There's a record of Edward complaining, quietly mind you, that he was a king and yet a prisoner. He wasn't allowed to go out and be seen by the people. Somerset wanted the public to see him as the saviour, the good duke. It's a classic power move. If you control the access to the source of power, you are the power. But then, 1549 happened. The year of many insurrections. Everything Somerset had been building just imploded. You had the Prayer Book Rebellion in the West Country because people hated the New English service. They called it a Christmas game. And then you had Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk. The whole country was on fire. And where was Somerset? He was in London, panicking, trying to play the populist hero while the nobility were sharpening their swords behind his back. This is where the story gets really weird. Somerset, realising the council was about to turn on him, basically kidnapped Edward. He took him from Hampton Court to Windsor Castle. Now, Windsor today is a lovely place for a weekend visit, but in October 1549, it was a damp, unfortified mess. Edward hated it. He actually wrote in his journal, and this is a rare moment of him sounding genuinely annoyed, that Windsor was a place of no defence, and he had a great room, which is just a fancy Tudor way of saying he had a massive, miserable cold. Imagine being 11 years old, sick with a fever, and your uncle is dragging you through the mud because he's terrified of losing his job. Somerset was standing on the ramparts shouting to the crowds that they were trying to kill their king. It was a total circus. But the council didn't back down. They called his bluff. Somerset eventually realised the game was up and he surrendered. He was sent to the Tower, and for a brief moment Edward must have thought, "Finally, I can breathe." But no. Enter John Dudley. We'll get to him later, but the shift from Somerset to Dudley was like moving from a blunt instrument to a scalpel. During Somerset's reign, Edward was a child to be managed. Under Dudley, he was a tool to be sharpened. Think about the psychological of that transition. You've just seen your favourite uncle, Thomas, executed, and then your protector uncle, Somerset, arrested, and eventually executed as well. Yes, Edward signed that warrant too with that same terrifyingly steady hand. The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. No mention of the fact that the man had basically raised him for 3 years. It's that coldness again. Or maybe it's just that by the time you're 12 and you've seen everyone you're supposed to trust try to use you, you just stop caring. Actually, let's take a tangent here. Do you think Edward was actually a bit of a psychopath? People say that about the Tudors, but if you're told from birth that you're a god on earth and then you see the humans around you acting like rabid dogs, maybe detachment is the only sane response. He wasn't a normal boy because normal didn't exist in his world. There was no playing out, there was only observing. Somerset's failure was that he underestimated the boy. He thought Edward was a puppet who wouldn't notice the strings. But Edward was counting the strings. He was learning how they were attached. He was watching how Somerset handled, or mishandled, the economy, the wars with Scotland, the rough wooing, which was a total disaster, by the way, and the religious shifts. He was taking notes. Literally. His journal is full of these dry, analytical observations about statecraft. There's this one bit where he's discussing the debasement of the coinage. Think about that. Most 12-year-olds are worried about, I don't know, a growth spurt. Edward was worried about the silver content in a shilling. He understood that the crown's power was tied to the economy. He was becoming a technocrat in an age of knights. And then there was the religious stuff. Somerset was a moderate compared to what came next. He wanted a slow change. Edward, influenced by his new mentors, wanted a revolution. He wanted the altars smashed. He wanted the gold melted down. He wanted the idols gone. It wasn't just about theology. It was about control. If you control the way people pray, you control the way they think. I wonder if he ever felt a pang of guilt about Somerset. Probably not. Guilt is an expensive emotion in the Tudor court, and the treasury was empty. By the time Somerset was gone, Edward was starting to find his own voice. It was a high, thin, but incredibly firm voice. He was starting to realise that as long as he was the one with the pen, he was the one who decided who lived and who died. A teenager who's had the humanity bored out of him by Latin and isolation, finally realising he's the most dangerous person in the room. Somerset thought he was the master, but he was really just the opening act. The main event was starting, and it was going to be much, much colder. God's own little iconoclast. That's what they were turning him into. You see, after Somerset was hauled off to the Tower, good riddance, Edward probably thought, though he'd never be so vulgar as to say it, the religious reforms didn't just speed up, they became a bit of an obsession. We're talking about a boy who was basically the 16th century version of a straight-A student who's discovered a very intense, very black and white ideology. He didn't just want to tweak the church, he wanted to scrub it clean until it bled. Think about the friction of the English landscape during this time. You're a peasant in a village in, say, Devon. For centuries, your world has been defined by the smell of incense, the glow of candles, and these beautiful familiar statues of saints that you pray to when your cow is sick or your child has a fever. Then, suddenly, these men arrive from London with orders from a kid king. They tell you the statues are idols, they smash the stained glass, they whitewash the wall paintings, vibrant scenes of heaven and hell replaced by nothing, just flat grey stone and some verses of English text that half the village can't even read. It's a psychic shock. It's like someone coming into your house and painting over all your family photos because they've decided memories are superstitious. And Edward? He was the one driving this. Or at least, he was the one nodding along with terrifying enthusiasm. He wasn't just a pawn here. He genuinely believed, with that peculiar, unyielding certainty that only a teenager can truly master, that he was responsible for the souls of his subjects. If they were worshipping bread instead of spirit, that was on him. It's a hell of a thing to put on a 12-year-old's conscience. He'd sit through these marathon sermons, sometimes 3 or 4 hours long. I mean, we struggle with a 20-minute podcast. And he'd take notes, detailed obsessive notes. He was looking for errors. He was looking for papistry. I wonder if he ever missed the beauty of it all. Probably not. Beauty to Edward was order. Beauty was a well-argued syllogism. There's a story, I think it might be from one of his tutors, about him seeing a crucifix and calling it a dead stick. But that was the logic of the time. If it wasn't in the Bible, it was a lie, and Edward was the ultimate fact-checker. Actually, have you ever noticed how people who are quite lonely often gravitate towards very rigid structures? If your human relationships are a mess, your dad's a tyrant, your mum's a ghost, your uncles are trying to kidnap you, then maybe the Word of God is the only thing that feels solid. It doesn't change, it doesn't lie to you, it doesn't execute its brother on a Tuesday morning. Edward's radicalism wasn't just politics, it was his anchor, but it caused absolute chaos. The 1552 Book of Common Prayer, the second one, the really Protestant one, was basically a middle finger to the old world. No more real presence in the bread, no more fancy vestments. The priests had to look like ordinary men. It was a revolution in a surplice. And Edward was right there, checking the proofs, making sure the language was sharp enough. He was a bit of a nerd, really, but a nerd with the power to burn people. He didn't burn many, to be fair. Not like his sister Mary would later. But he was perfectly happy to let people rot in prison if they wouldn't conform. He even had a go at Mary, his own sister. They had this famous, incredibly awkward confrontation where he told her, essentially, that she was a heretic, and she had to stop having mass in her private chapel. Mary, who was twice his age and had been through 10 times more trauma, just looked at him and said, "My soul is God's, and my body is the king's. You can have the body, but you can't have the soul." Edward actually cried. Not because he was sad for her, but because he was frustrated that he couldn't control her. It's that Tudor will hitting a brick wall. It wasn't just religious either. It was economic. All that gold and silver they stripped from the churches, it didn't go to the poor. It went into the pockets of the new men, the Dudleys and the Herberts. Edward must have seen this. He was smart. He knew his council was full of greedy bastards, but he needed them. It's the classic compromise. You want to build a New Jerusalem, but you have to use the devil's architects to do it. You know those ruins you see in the English countryside today? Tintern, fountains, Glastonbury. In Edward's time, those weren't romantic ruins. They were active construction sites, or deconstruction sites. Men were ripping the lead off the roofs, melting down the bells, turning the cloisters into stables. It must have been so loud, so violent. And Edward, this neat, tidy boy, would have seen it as progress. He was clearing the ground for the truth, But the truth is a heavy thing to carry, and as he got older, 13, 14, the intensity only increased. He was becoming a king in his own right. He was attending council meetings regularly. He wasn't just the signature anymore, he was the voice. And it was a voice that sounded remarkably like a judge. He was becoming the very thing his father was, just with a different set of books. It's a bit scary when you think about it. If he'd lived to be 40, what would England have looked like? A Protestant version of Geneva? A place where every thought was policed and every image was smashed? Maybe. He had the drive for it. He had the lack of empathy that makes for a great or terrible reformer. But the clock was ticking, wasn't it? All that fire, all that certainty, and it was all housed in a body that was starting to fail him. I've wondered, and this is a bit of a weird thought, if he saw his own health as a reflection of his spiritual state. The Tudors were big on that. If you were sick, God was angry. But Edward was the most Christian king. He was the new Josiah. Why would he be coughing? Why would he be tired? Maybe that's why he pushed the reforms so hard in those final years. He was trying to finish the job before the dead stick of his own mortality caught up with him. Anyway, it's a bit of a grim picture. A boy smashing a world he didn't quite understand to build one that nobody really asked for. But that's the thing about idealists. They're usually the most dangerous people in the room, and Edward was the most idealistic Tudor of them all. So, let's talk about the loneliness. It's a bit of a heavy word, but for Edward, it was the literal architecture of his life. You have this boy who owns everything, yet has nothing that's actually his. Not even his time. There's this concept in the Tudor court, the whipping boy. Now, historians argue whether Barnaby Fitzpatrick was a literal whipping boy. You know, the kid who gets thrashed when the prince messes up a Latin declension because you can't exactly hit a king. But whether it was physical or not, the emotional dynamic was there. Barnaby was Edward's only real friend, the only person he could sort of exhale around. And what does the council do? They send Barnaby to France, of course they do. Can't have the king getting too attached to someone they can't control, can we? It's heart-wrenching, really. Edward writes these letters to Barnaby that are, well, for him, practically gushing. He tells him to wear his clothes well, and to avoid excessive women in the French court. It's like a big brother, or a nervous friend, trying to keep a connection alive through a quill pen. But back in London, Edward is back in those lonely, echoing rooms. I was thinking the other day, total side note, about how we use lonely and alone interchangeably. But Edward was never alone. He was constantly surrounded. He had the groom of the stool. Yes, that is exactly what it sounds like, the man who helped him with his bathroom business, and a literal army of servants. He was watched while he ate, watched while he slept, probably watched while he picked his nose. But he was profoundly, utterly lonely. There's a friction there, a grating of the soul, when you're a spectacle but never a person. He'd retreat into these lonely rooms, the private galleries where he'd look at his maps. He was obsessed with maps. I think it's because a map is a world you can actually dominate. You can run your finger over the coast of Scotland or the fortifications at Berwick and it stays put. It doesn't plot against you. It doesn't die of a room. He spent hours studying the tides, the depths of harbours. He was a data nerd before data was a thing. If he were alive today, he'd probably be one of those guys who has 14 spreadsheets to track his sleep cycles. And his household, God, it must have been stifling. There's this record of him being chastised by his governors for being too cold. They wanted him to be more princely, more charismatic like his father. But how do you act like Henry VIII when you've been raised in a laboratory? He was a product of a system that valued his brain and his blood, but had absolutely no use for his heart. Imagine him at night. The candles are flickering, the heavy tapestries are moving in the breeze. Tudor palaces were notoriously drafty, you know, and he's just there, waiting to grow up, waiting for the day he doesn't have to ask permission to go for a ride in the park. There was this one incident where he wanted to go to a particular house, and his governors just said no. A king. And he couldn't even choose his own Sunday afternoon. It makes you wonder if that's why he was so harsh with the religious reforms. It was the one area where they let him be the boss. Fine. I can't go for a ride, but I can definitely make you change the liturgy of the entire country. How about that? It's a bit of a small man syndrome, but with a crown. Or maybe just a small boy syndrome. He was trying to find a footprint to leave in a world that was trying to erase him into a mere symbol. And the silence of those rooms, it must have been deafening. No music. Well, there was court music, but it was formal. No games, really. He played cards sometimes, but he recorded his losses and wins with the same clinical detachment he used for everything else. He once lost 5 shillings to his tutor and wrote it down like it was a national debt. Maybe he wanted to scream, to just smash one of those expensive Venetian glass vases and see what happened. But he couldn't. The Tudor mask was already too thick. He was a boy who had been taught that his primary duty was to be a monument. And monuments don't scream. They just sit there and let the pigeons land on them. There's this really telling bit in his journal where he mentions a great fire in the city. He describes the physics of it, the way the wind carried the sparks. Not a word about the people who lost their homes, not a word about the fear. It's all the wind was from the northeast. It's a defense mechanism. If you focus on the wind direction, you don't have to hear the screaming. And that's how he lived. In a series of beautiful, cold, highly regulated boxes, from the nursery to the schoolroom to the council chamber. He was a king who was being handled like a piece of high-quality plutonium. Everyone knew he was powerful. Everyone knew he was dangerous, so they kept him behind lead-lined walls and only let him out for controlled reactions. His skin against those heavy velvet robes. They were so stiff they could almost stand up on their own. Everything about his life was stiff. Everything was scripted, and in the middle of it all was this thin, pale teenager with a cough that wouldn't go away, wondering when his real life was supposed to start. It wouldn't. He was already in the middle of the only life he was going to get, and it was mostly spent looking out of windows at a world he wasn't allowed to touch. It's a bit tragic. We look at him and see a powerful monarch. But if you look closer, through the historical record, you just see a kid who really, really missed his friend Barnaby and didn't know how to say it. So, we've arrived at the point where the duel starts to show its edges. It's 1551, 1552, and Edward is hitting his mid-teens. Now we all know what teenagers are like. That sudden, prickly desire for autonomy, the slamming of doors. But when you're a Tudor king, you don't slam doors. You rewrite the law of the land. This was his paper rebellion. He couldn't exactly lead an army against his own council, so he used the only weapons he'd been allowed to master, his pen, his inkwell, and his terrifyingly sharp intellect. I was reading some of his memoranda the other day. Well, not the originals, obviously. I'm not that posh. And the level of detail is just, it's slightly unhinged. He started writing these remembrances for the council. It was his way of saying, I'm watching you. He'd list out the debts of the crown, the state of the navy, the precise number of troops in the garrisons. It's like he was trying to out-audit the adults. Imagine being a seasoned politician like John Dudley, who's now the Duke of Northumberland and basically running the show, and having this 14-year-old kid hand you a list of suggestions that are actually incredibly well-researched critiques of your foreign policy. The atmosphere in those council meetings must have been thick enough to cut with a halberd. And the diary, we have to go back to the journal. It's such a weird document. It's not, "Dear diary, I'm feeling a bit sad today." It's a cold, hard logbook of a state. But in these later years, you see him asserting himself. He's no longer the subject of the sentences, he's the verb. He talks about the king's pleasure and the king's will. He's testing the weight of his own voice. If we think about his physical reality and his mental state, physically he was still this slight, pale boy, probably still struggling with that room every winter. But mentally he was becoming a titan. He was obsessed with the idea of a godly commonwealth. He didn't just want to be king, he wanted to be the architect of a perfect Protestant society. He wrote this long essay about the reformation of abuses, where he basically rants about how the greed of the nobility is ruining the country. Which is hilarious, considering the guys he's giving the essay to are the exact people doing the greedy bit. It's a bit like a CEO's son writing a manifesto about how much he hates capitalism and then handing it to the board of directors. There's this one part I have to take. Did you know he was actually quite good at the manly stuff too? He wasn't just a bookworm. He was a decent shot with a bow and he loved the tilt, but even there, he was clinical. He'd record his scores. He'd analyse his technique. There was no joy in it, just performance. It's that Tudor need to be the best at everything. He once participated in a running at the ring and noted down exactly how many times he succeeded compared to the other lords. It's almost as if he was trying to prove to himself that he was a real Tudor, a real man, despite the fact that he was still being told when to go to bed. But the real rebellion was the religion. Oh, the religion. He pushed for the 42 Articles of Religion, which eventually became the 39 Articles that still define the Church of England. He was getting more radical by the day. He wanted to purge everything that smelled of Rome, and he was doing it through these tiny, incremental paper cuts to the old guard. I wonder if he knew he didn't have much time. People say he was always sickly, which actually isn't true. He was quite robust for most of his childhood. But maybe there's an intuition that comes with being a miracle child. You know, the price that was paid for your birth, your mother's life, the destruction of the old church. Maybe he felt he had to earn his existence every single day. There was this moment with Bishop Ridley, a famous reformer, who gave a sermon about the poor. Edward was so moved, or maybe just so focused on the logic of it, that he sent for Ridley and asked, "What can I do?" And from that, we got the founding of Bridewell, St. Thomas's and Christ's Hospital. It's the one part of his rebellion that felt human. He was using his power to actually build something that wasn't just a theological argument. But even then, Northumberland was always in the corner, whispering, guiding the pen. Dudley was a clever man. He realised that if he couldn't control the king through force, like Somerset tried, he'd do it through alignment. He became the ultimate Protestant to please Edward. He'd sit and listen to the boys' long-winded ideas about currency reform and nod like he was hearing the word of God. It worked. Edward trusted him, and that trust, that paper alliance, would eventually lead to one of the biggest disasters in English history. It's a bit of a tragedy of the intellect, isn't it? Edward was finally becoming the king he was trained to be. He was finding his feet, finding his voice, finding his power. He was 15 years old, and for the first time people were actually starting to be afraid of him. Not just his title, but him. The kid who'd been scrubbed with soap and fed Greek verbs was finally starting to bite back. But then the air in the gallery changed, the cough came back, and this time it didn't sound like a room, it sounded like the end, and all those papers, all those memoranda, all those plans for a godly commonwealth were suddenly just scrap. It's the ultimate friction, the collision between a massive will and a failing body. It started, well, the beginning of the end if you want to be dramatic about it, in February 1553. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was more like a slow, irritating leak in a bucket. Edward caught a fever. No big deal, right? He'd had them before, but this one, it didn't lift. It settled into his chest like a heavy damp wool blanket. And then the cough started. Not just a tickle, but that deep racking sound that makes everyone in the room go a bit quiet and look at their shoes. The silence in the palace during those weeks. Whitehall is this massive, sprawling mess of buildings. It was the largest palace in Europe at the time, you know. And yet, the atmosphere narrowed down to a single bedchamber. Outside, the world was going on as usual. People were buying fish at Billingsgate, the Thames was flowing, the sun was occasionally appearing. But inside, the panic was starting to curdle. Northumberland, that clever, calculating duke, must have heard that first cough and felt the ground start to liquefy beneath his feet. Because here's the thing, Edward was the only thing keeping Northumberland from the gallows. If the king died, the next in line was Mary. And Mary, Well, Mary remembered everything. She remembered who'd bullied her about her religion, who'd tried to stop her mass, and who'd basically sidelined her for years. Northumberland knew that if Mary took the throne, he was a dead man walking. So, the friction in that sick room wasn't just about medicine, it was about survival. And the doctors, God, the Tudor doctors. If you ever feel like the NHS is having a bad day, just be glad you aren't being treated by a 16th century royal physician. They didn't know about germs, obviously. They thought everything was about humours. Too much blood? Drain it. Too much phlegm? Make him vomit. They were basically attacking a dying boy with cures that would kill a healthy horse. They gave him things like speckled pottage and various concoctions of herbs and probably ground up bits of things that should never be ground up. There is a report about the state of his lungs. They described him spitting up tough greenish and blackish matter. Sorry, that's a bit grim. But it's important. It suggests it wasn't just tuberculosis, which is the classic historical diagnosis, but perhaps an acute infection, like bronchopneumonia, following a bout of the measles he'd had the year before. His immune system, probably weakened by all that obsessive soap scrubbing and isolation I mentioned earlier, just folded. Imagine being 15 and your body is literally drowning from the inside out, and you're the king. You can't just be sick in peace. You have to give audiences, you have to prove you're still alive so the markets don't crash and the French don't invade. There's this heartbreaking moment where they actually propped him up at a window in Greenwich Palace so the crowds could see him. He looked like a ghost. His skin was turning a yellowish grey, and he could barely lift his hand. The people didn't cheer. They went home and started praying or plotting, depending on their leanings. Edward must have been the realisation that his godly commonwealth was slipping through his fingers. All that work, all those papers we talked about, the 42 articles, it was all going to be undone by a Catholic sister he didn't trust. You can see the shift in his journal, or rather, the lack of it. The journal stops. The man of words runs out of them. It's the ultimate silence. This is a bit of a weird thought. Does he felt a sense of betrayal? He'd been such a good boy. He'd done everything his tutors told him. He'd smashed the idols. He'd studied the Greek. He'd been the perfect Protestant Josiah. And this was the reward? A slow, suffocating death in a room that smelled of medicinal vinegar and desperation. It doesn't seem fair. But history isn't fair. It's just what happened. Northumberland, meanwhile, was going into overdrive. He wasn't just sitting by the bed with a wet cloth. He was drafting. He was whispering. He was looking at Edward and seeing a fading candle, and he was desperately trying to find a new lamp to light. He brought in his own doctors, including a mysterious woman who claimed she could cure the king with some secret elixir. It probably had arsenic in it. Edward's legs started to swell, edema, and his skin began to crack. It was a miserable, undignified end for a boy who had been so obsessed with order and purity. There's this one story, it might be apocryphal, but I like it, that Edward was heard praying in his bed, "Lord God, deliver me out of this miserable and wretched life." He was ready to go. He'd been a king for 6 years, and it had been nothing but pressure, loneliness, and heavy robes. The living was finally becoming more than he could bear, but Northumberland wasn't done with him yet. Not by a long shot. He needed that hand, that shaky, dying hand, to sign one more thing. The devise for the succession. It was a legal gamble that would change everything, and it required a boy who could barely breathe to act like a titan one last time. It's funny, isn't it? We think of kings as having all the power, but in that room, Edward was the least powerful person there. He was just a body being kept alive by political necessity. A teenager who wanted to sleep, being poked and prodded by men who were terrified of what would happen when he finally closed his eyes. It's a bit chilling how a person can get used to the smell of blood, especially when it's your own family's. We need to talk about the friction of the scaffold, the sheer brutal reality of what Edward had to witness, or rather authorise, while he was still essentially a child. By 1552, he'd already seen both of his Seymour uncles, his mother's brothers, lose their heads. First Thomas, the fun one who shot the dog, and then Somerset, the protector. And Edward's reaction, it was practically robotic. If you look at his journal entry for Somerset's execution again, it's just a single flat sentence. The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off on Tower Hill between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. That's it. No, I'm sorry, Uncle, no. The palace feels a bit empty today. It's like he was recording the delivery of a load of coal. Maybe that was a genuine lack of empathy, or just a soul that had been compressed into a diamond by the pressure of the court. If you don't care, it can't hurt you, right? It's a survival tactic, a very grim one. But there's a friction there, a psychic cost. You can't just lop off your relatives' heads and not have it change the way you see the world. It made Edward realise that everyone is replaceable. Everyone. And if they are replaceable, then he has to be indispensable. He became even more obsessed with his work, his paper rebellion that I mentioned earlier. But let's take another aspect for a second. Do you think the public hated him for it? Actually, they mostly blamed the advisors. The king is but a child, they'd say. It's the classic English excuse. The king is good. It's just the evil counsellors you have to watch out for. But Edward wasn't just a passive bystander. He was learning the Game of Thrones before it was a brand. He was watching Northumberland, John Dudley, take the reins. Dudley was a different beast entirely. Where Somerset was arrogant and blundering, Dudley was smooth. He was a military man, a fixer. He didn't lecture Edward, he consulted him. He made Edward feel like he was finally the one in charge. What do you think, Your Majesty? It's the ultimate flattery for a teenage boy who's been told what to do since he was in nappies. Though, was that Dudley was also a man who'd do anything to keep his power. He'd helped bring Somerset down, and Edward knew it. It's a bit like being friends with a shark. You're fine as long as you're the one feeding it, but don't get any blood in the water. And in 1552, the blood was starting to flow. There were more executions, more purges of the old guard. After Somerset was executed, the king's apartments must have been deathly quiet. Edward would be there with his books, his maps, always the maps, and he'd be thinking about the succession. He knew Mary was waiting. He knew she hated everything he stood for, and his religious zeal and his family tie was starting to heat up. Actually, let's go off on a bit of a wander here. Did you know Edward was a bit of a fashion icon in his own very sober way? He moved away from the peacock bright colours of his father's era. He liked blacks, greys and deep purples. It was Protestant chic. Very restrained. Very... I am a serious person who might have you arrested for heresy. He was projecting an image of stability, while everything around him was actually quite chaotic. There was this one incident, I think it was around the time of Somerset's fall, where Edward was seen playing a game of base, a bit like tag, with some other boys. For a few minutes he was just a kid running around in the sun. But then a messenger arrived. He put on the mask again, and the boy vanished. The king returned. It's that constant switching, that friction between the human and the crown, that must have been so exhausting. By the time we get to the end of 1552, Edward is 15. He's legally coming of age. He's supposed to take full power at 16. You can feel the tension in the council. They're all thinking, what happens when the boy starts choosing his own advisors? Dudley was worried. The Seymours who were left were worried. And then the cough started. The deadly cough in the gallery that I promised we'd talk about. It was the ultimate friction, the moment when political ambition hits the brick wall of biological reality. I've always found it a bit ironic that a boy who was so obsessed with purity and cleansing the church was eventually consumed by a disease that literally rotted him from the inside. It's a bit too on the nose for a novelist, but history doesn't care about subtlety. It just gives you the facts: a boy king, a blood-stained scaffold, and a pair of lungs that were starting to turn into stone. It makes you wonder, if he'd been a bit more human, a bit less of a godly iconoclast, would he have been happier? Probably not. Happiness wasn't a Tudor value. Survival was. And Edward was surviving, right up until he wasn't. The blood on the scaffold was just a preview of the chaos that was coming, and the man holding the pen, John Dudley, was already looking for the next piece of paper to sign. So, while the king's lungs are essentially turning into a bit of a swamp, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, is playing a very high-stakes game of Tetris with the English throne. He's not a man to just sit there and watch the sand run out of the hourglass without trying to flip it over, you know? He looked at the law, he looked at the dying boy, and he saw his own head on a spike if he didn't move fast. Mary was the looming shadow, a Catholic storm cloud. And Dudley? Well, he'd spent the last few years stripping the altars bare and enriching himself. He knew she wouldn't just give him a slap on the wrist. This is where the Dudley gamble gets really, well, messy. He had this son, Guildford. A bit of a non-entity, really. History hasn't been kind to Guildford Dudley, mostly portraying him as a bit of a spoiled brat who cried when he didn't get his way. But he was a Dudley. And then there was Lady Jane Grey. She was Edward's cousin, a teenager like him. And, this is the crucial bit, she was just as much of a Protestant nerd as the king was. She read Plato for fun while everyone else was out hunting. So, Dudley thinks, right, let's marry them off. It was a marriage of political convenience, pushed through in May 1553, while Edward was literally coughing up bits of himself in the next room. Maybe Jane Grey knew she was being used as a human shield. She reportedly hated the idea of marrying Guildford. She actually became physically ill from the stress of it. But in the Tudor world, your feelings were about as important as the price of fish in a landlocked village. You did what you were told. And Edward? He approved it. He was all for it. He saw Jane as the godly alternative to his sister Mary. It's a bit of a weird family dynamic. I'm dying, so I'll just bypass my own sisters and hand the crown to my cousin because she likes the same prayer books as I do. The atmosphere in Greenwich Palace during that May must have been utterly surreal. You've got the festive decorations for a wedding on one side of the house, and the smell of death and medicinal vinegar on the other. A bit like a party on the Titanic after the iceberg had already said hello. Northumberland was constantly at the king's bedside, whispering, coaxing. He wasn't just a puppet master, that's too simple. He was more like a software developer trying to rewrite the king's succession.exe file before the hardware crashed for good. There's this one report from a French ambassador, I think it was de Noailles, who noted that the king's legs were so swollen he couldn't even move in bed. He was in agony. And yet, Dudley kept the business of state going. He kept the lawyers coming in. He needed a document. He needed the device for the succession. This wasn't a Parliament-approved law. It was basically a dying boy's doodle that they tried to turn into a legal reality. It excluded Mary. It excluded Elizabeth, which must have been a bit of a sting for her, considering how close she and Edward once were, and it gave everything to the Lady Jane and her heirs male. Actually, wait, let's look at the heirs male bit. Originally the document said the crown would go to the sons of Lady Jane, but there were no sons. She'd only just got married. So someone, and you can see the scratchy, hurried correction on the original parchment, changed it to the Lady Jane and her heirs male. That one little "and" was the difference between a peaceful transition and a civil war. A tiny stroke of a pen while the king is gasping for air. Do you ever get the feeling that the people in charge have absolutely no idea what they're doing? Because that's the vibe you get from Dudley in the summer of '53. He was talented, sure, but he was also desperate. He was forcing the judges to sign the device, and they were terrified. They knew it was illegal. They knew Henry VIII's will was the law of the land, and you couldn't just overrule it with a dying teenager's signature. One of the judges, Montague, actually said it was treason, but Dudley just roared at them. He said he'd fight anyone in his shirt to make it happen. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and Edward, in his brief moments of clarity, was convinced he was doing God's work. He wasn't being fooled by Dudley. He was a willing participant. He wanted to save England from the idolatry of his sister. He saw himself as a martyr king, finishing the Reformation from his deathbed. It's a bit tragic, really. This 15-year-old kid thinks he's saving the world, but he's actually just setting the stage for a massacre. He was so focused on the theology that he forgot about the people. The English people actually quite liked Mary. They saw her as the rightful heir. They didn't care about the fine print of the Eucharist. They cared about the rules of the game. The wedding night of Jane and Guildford. What a miserable affair that must have been. The Duke of Northumberland probably stood outside the door like a nervous hen hoping for a pregnancy that would secure his line before the king stopped breathing. It's all so transactional, so cold. There's no room for people in this story, only titles and claims. By June, the king was essentially a living corpse. His doctors had given up. The mysterious woman with her arsenic-based cures had made his hair fall out and his nails turn black. It's a gruesome, horrifying way to go. And yet, the paperwork continued. The signatures were gathered. The trap was set. All they needed now was for the heart to stop, so they could spring the Lady Jane on a country that hadn't even been told the king was sick. It's the silence that gets me. They kept the palace locked down. No one was allowed in or out without Dudley's say-so. They were trying to hold back the tide with a handful of legal jargon. But the tide was coming in, and it was wearing a Catholic crucifix. The Dudley gamble was a masterpiece of planning and a total failure of human understanding. He understood the how, but he completely missed the why. And the why was sitting in a manor house in East Anglia, waiting for a messenger to tell her that her brother was dead and her kingdom was being stolen. So, we have this document, the devise. It's a bit of a scrap of paper, really, stained with God knows what from the sick room, and it's trying to do the impossible. It's trying to delete Mary. Edward's sitting there, or rather reclining because he can't really sit anymore, and he's obsessing over the phrasing. He actually wrote the first draft in his own hand. You see the clash between his legalistic mind and the messy reality of his sisters. He calls them bastards, again. Even though his father had sort of unbastardized them in the 1544 Act of Succession. Edward just goes back to the old 1530s logic because it suits his religious purpose. It's funny how we use truth as a bit of a flexible concept when we're trying to get our own way, isn't it? Imagine being Sir Edward Montague. You're summoned to the bedside of a dying boy king who looks like he's already halfway to the grave, and standing over him is Northumberland, looking like he's ready to strangle you with his bare hands. The king tells you, in this thin, wheezing voice, that you must turn this device into a proper letters patent. Montague says it's treason. He says it'll lead to a bloodbath. And Edward, he doesn't waver. He doesn't have the energy to shout, but he has that Tudor ice in his veins. He just stares them down. A teenager using his last ounces of strength to force grown men into a conspiracy. Have you ever noticed how the most principled people are often the most dangerous? Edward believed he was being a hero. He thought he was Josiah. He thought he was saving England from the whore of Babylon. But he was also essentially disinheriting his own family. It's a very specific kind of religious blinkering. He's looking at Mary, and he doesn't see a sister who'd once brought him gifts or shared his grief when Henry died. He sees a spiritual infection that needs to be cauterized. The device went through several iterations. It's a bit like watching someone try to fix a leaky pipe with sticky tape. First, it was just the sons of Lady Jane. Then, realizing that was a bit of a long shot since she wasn't even pregnant, they changed it to Jane herself. It's such a blatant, desperate power grab by the Dudleys, but they're wrapping it in the language of the gospel. It's the ultimate 16th century spin job. Northumberland was running around London trying to secure the tower, trying to get the mint to start striking coins with Jane's face on them, though they never actually got that far. And the king? He was fading. Fast. By the middle of June 1553 he was barely conscious, but every time he woke up he'd ask about the devise. Had the Great Seal been applied? Had the Lord signed it? He was ticking off his bucket list, and the only item on it was Stop Mary. It's a bit of a tragic obsession. He should have been making his peace with the world, maybe saying goodbye to his sisters, who, by the way, were kept far away. But instead, he was a bureaucrat to the bitter end. Does he ever regretted it? Probably not. The Tudors weren't big on regret. They were big on the will of God, which, conveniently, always seemed to match their own. There's a record of him being propped up to sign the final version of the document. His signature is a mess. It's usually so neat, so precise. But this one looks like a spider fell into an ink pot and had a seizure across the page. That's the physical reality of the device. It's the signature of a boy who is being held upright by the sheer political will of the men around him. And London. London was a tinderbox. People knew something was up. The palace was locked down, but whispers always get out. The king is dead. The king is poisoned. The king is being kept in a cage. The rumours were flying like pigeons. Northumberland tried to keep the lid on it because he needed to catch Mary. That was the plan. Get the device signed, wait for Edward to die, and then grab Mary before she could raise an army. It was a race against a heartbeat. There's this one weird detail in an old chronicle that Dudley actually sent for Mary, telling her Edward wanted to see her. A trap. A total red wedding moment. But she got a warning. Someone, we don't know who, maybe a disgruntled servant or a secret Catholic on the council, slipped her a message saying, "Don't come." She turned her horse around and galloped for East Anglia. That one decision changed the course of everything. If she'd walked into the palace, Edward's device might actually have worked. She'd have been in the tower before the king's body was cold. It's these little what-ifs that make history so maddening. A single messenger, a horse that didn't go lame, a sister who listened to her gut. While Edward lay there, drowning in his own lungs, the real power was already shifting away from the sick room and out into the dusty roads of England. The device was legally perfect. Well, as perfect as a forced document can be, but it was politically useless because it ignored the one thing you can't control, the public sense of fair play. But back in the room, the candles were burning low. The doctors were essentially just spectators now. They were watching the new Josiah crumble into dust, and Northumberland was realising that his perfect plan had a massive Mary-shaped hole in it. He'd got the ink, he'd got the signatures, he'd got the device. But he'd lost the initiative. It's a bit like a game of chess where you've taken all the pieces but your opponent has just flipped the table. Edward was the table, and he was about to break. The heat of that July in 1553 must have been absolutely stifling. Greenwich Palace is right on the river, but when you're dying of a pulmonary infection, the damp air from the Thames isn't exactly a tonic. It's a weight, and the medical cures being shoved down Edward's throat. They were getting increasingly bizarre. I mentioned that mysterious woman earlier. She's one of those figures who pops up in the margins of history. Some say she was a Dudley plant, others say she was a last-ditch desperate hope. She promised to draw out the humours, and the result was that his skin started to peel and his limbs became almost black. It sounds like something out of a horror film. A teenage king, the most powerful boy in the world, being slowly poisoned by quackery in a room that probably hadn't had a window opened in weeks because they were terrified of miasmas. Actually, let's go off on a bit of a wander about 16th century pain management, or the lack of it. They had opium, sure, laudanum in various forms, but they were so worried about the king's spirit that they didn't want to dull his mind too much, so he was awake for most of it. Awake while his lungs filled with fluid, awake while his skin cracked. There's a record of him crying out that he couldn't breathe. It's the sort of detail that makes you want to reach back through the centuries and just, I don't know, Give him an inhaler. It's so needlessly cruel. And all the while, the device is being polished, and the Duke is pacing the hallways, probably checking his pocket watch every 5 minutes to see if the king has kicked the bucket yet. Think about the quiet cruelty of the Tudor court. It wasn't just the executions, it was the way they treated a human body as a political asset. Edward wasn't allowed to just die. He had to be preserved until the paperwork was done. They were feeding him gold leaf and ground pearls. Can you imagine? Trying to swallow grit when you can barely catch your breath. They thought the purity of the pearls would help. It's such a beautiful, useless idea, like trying to put out a forest fire with a perfume bottle. And the smells. Oh God, the smells. A 16th century sick room in the middle of a hot summer. You've got the smell of unwashed bodies, because remember, baths were dangerous, mixed with rotting meat, the gangrene on his legs, medicinal vinegar, and the heavy cloying scent of incense, because the reformers still liked a bit of a nice smell, even if they hated the theology. It must have been a sensory nightmare. And Edward, this boy who'd been raised in the cleanest, most scrubbed rooms in England, was now at the centre of this organic decay. It's a bit of a metaphor for his reign, the high ideals of the godly commonwealth rotting away in the heat of human ambition. This is a bit of a weird detail, but stay with me, that the people of London were seeing prodigies. A storm that knocked a weathercock off a church, a calf born with 2 heads, that sort of thing. People were terrified. They knew the king was dying, even if the government was lying about it. There was this sense of an ending, not just an ending of a life, but an ending of an era. The boy king was supposed to be the future, but the future was looking increasingly like a graveyard. One of his doctors, a man named Girolamo Cardano, well, he was more of a philosopher-astrologer who'd visited a bit earlier, had predicted Edward would live to be 50. Talk about a bad Yelp review. Cardano had looked at Edward's stars and seen a long, prosperous life. It just goes to show that even the smartest men of the age were just guessing in the dark. The reality was much simpler. A teenage boy with a vulnerable chest had been pushed too hard by a world that didn't have room for a child. There's this one moment, near the very end, where Edward supposedly looked at his hands and said, "I am glad to die." I wonder if he meant it. I think I would. If your life is just a series of painful cures and people arguing over your signature, the grave must look like a very peaceful library. No more doctors, no more uncles, no more device for the succession. Just quiet. But the Duke wasn't going to let him go quietly. He was still trying to get the London authorities to swear allegiance to Jane. He was throwing banquets to distract people. It's the ultimate "the show must go on" energy, but the lead actor is literally dying in the wings. It is fascinating how humans can ignore the obvious when they're scared. Everyone in that palace knew the king was a goner, but they all kept acting like he was just having a bad spell. They were talking about the autumn progress, the upcoming hunt, the new buildings at Whitehall. It's a collective delusion, a shared lie to keep the panic at bay. And the weather. I keep coming back to the weather. It was a dark summer. Even though it was hot, there were these sudden, violent thunderstorms. The sky would go black at 3 in the afternoon. It was as if the atmosphere itself was echoing the mess inside the king's chest. The July rain was starting to gather. The kind of rain that doesn't wash things clean. It just turns everything to mud. Edward's final days were a blur of prayer and pain. He was talking to God more than to the people around him. Maybe he felt God was the only one who wasn't trying to get something out of him. Or maybe he was just delirious. He was 15. He should have been worrying about his first crush or whether his beard was ever going to grow in. Instead, he was worrying about the eternal state of the English soul. It's a hell of a burden. No wonder his heart was giving out. The pressure was just too much. The pressure of being the perfect prince, the pressure of the Reformation, the pressure of the Duke's ambition. In the end, Edward VI didn't just die of tuberculosis. He died of being a Tudor. It's a terminal condition. And as the candles burned down to the wax on that final evening, the jewel was finally about to break. The night itself, the 6th of July, was something out of a Gothic fever dream. Usually summer nights in Greenwich have this soft, lapping sound of the river against the stone, but not this time. A massive thunderstorm rolled in, the kind that makes the windows rattle in their casements and turns the sky a bruised purple, the boy king, gasping his last while the heavens literally scream. Edward was in the arms of one of his favourite servants, Sir Henry VIII. It's a small mercy, I suppose, that he died being held by a person rather than a committee. His last words were supposedly, "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me and take my spirit." Simple, direct, a bit of a relief after years of theological jargon. And then the candle went out. He was 15 years, 8 months, and some odd days old. A life measured in chapters of Greek and Latin, ending in a dark room while the rain hammered on the roof. Now, this is where things get truly Tudor. Northumberland didn't open the doors and announce the tragedy. No, he did the exact opposite. He locked the palace down even tighter. He needed time. He had to keep the king alive for at least 2 more days to get his ducks in a row. Imagine the poor servants having to go in and out of that room with bowls of broth and clean linens for a corpse. The smell, God, it must have been unbearable in that heat, was masked with massive amounts of rosemary and sweet herbs. They were literally perfuming a lie. Hay even put the king's body in a leaden coffin almost immediately, but they didn't tell the public. They kept the guard changed. They kept the menus posted. It's a bit like Weekend at Bernie's, but with more velvet and higher stakes. Northumberland was desperately trying to lure Mary into London before the news broke. He sent a message saying the king was improved and wanted her company. It's a cold-blooded move, isn't it? Using a brother's death as a baited hook for his sister. But Mary wasn't playing along. She'd already slipped away to Framlingham Castle. She was smarter than they gave her credit for. While Northumberland was busy hiding a body, Mary was busy raising an army. She knew that in England, legitimacy beats theology 9 times out of 10. People might have liked the new prayer book, but they loved the idea of a rightful queen. And the Londoners, they were suspicious. You can't hide a royal death for long in a city that lives on gossip. The lack of sightings at the window, the way the council members were scurrying about with grey faces, it was obvious. There's this wonderful gritty detail from a contemporary diary about a man who was arrested for saying the king was already dead and rotting in a chest. He was right, of course, but you didn't get rewarded for being right in 1553. You got your ears nailed to a pillory. When they finally did announce it, and they brought out Lady Jane Grey to be proclaimed queen, the silence from the crowd was deafening. No cheers. No, God save the Queen. Just a lot of people looking at their boots. Jane herself apparently fainted when she was told she was the monarch. She didn't want the crown. She was a 16-year-old girl who wanted to be left alone with her books. She was the Queen of 9 Days, a tragic footnote in a game played by men who should have known better. I think about the quiet in the palace after the news finally broke. The frantic energy of the last few months just evaporated. All those plans, the devise, the letters patent, they were just paper again. Without the living breath of the king to animate them, they were useless. Northumberland had built his house on the sand of a teenager's health, and the tide had come in. The funeral didn't even happen for weeks. They kept him in that leaden box, while the country spiralled into a mini-civil war. Mary was marching on London, and the council, those same men who'd sworn on their lives to support Jane, were suddenly remembering that they'd always been Mary's biggest fans. It's a masterclass in political flexibility. One day you're a radical Protestant revolutionary. The next, you're dusting off your rosary beads and shouting, "Long live Queen Mary." Let's talk about that funeral. It was a weird hybrid affair. Mary, who was now firmly in charge, insisted on a Catholic requiem mass for her brother's soul. But because Edward had been the head of the Protestant Church, they also had a Protestant service at Westminster Abbey. It was the first time 2 different religious ceremonies were held for the same person at the same time. A final jarring clash of 2 worlds over a coffin. I wonder if Edward would have hated that. Probably. He was a purist. The idea of sharing a funeral with a Catholic mass would have made his skin crawl if he'd had any left, but he was gone. He was just a memory now, a godly imp who had tried to change the world and ended up being a catalyst for its temporary reversal. He was a boy who never got to be a man, a king who never got to rule without a protector, and a son who never quite escaped his father's shadow, even in death. So, we're left with a ghost. Not a literal one, though the corridors of Hampton Court have plenty of those stories, but a political ghost that basically haunted the rest of the Tudor century. You see, when Edward breathed his last, he didn't just leave a crown, he left a massive, gaping hole in the English identity. Mary comes in, and she's got her work cut out for her. She spends 5 years trying to rewind the clock, trying to pretend the boy king and his smashing of idols never happened. She brings back the Latin, the incense, and eventually the fires at Smithfield. But the thing about smashing an idol is that you can't really glue the pieces back together without the cracks showing. Map of London from the 1560s. This is a bit of a jump, I know, and it's fascinating how many of the hospitals and schools Edward founded are still there. Even while Mary was busy burning heretics, the foundations Edward laid were quietly holding firm. He was a teenager who changed the architecture of the country while he was still struggling with his homework. And then, of course, there's Elizabeth. She's the one who really inherited the mess. She had to navigate that middle ground, the via media, because she'd seen what happened when you pushed too hard like Edward did, and what happened when you tried to go back like Mary did. Actually, small thought, do you think Edward would have liked Elizabeth's version of the church? Probably not. He'd have thought it was a muddled compromise. He was a black and white kid in a world that was stubbornly grey. But without his radicalism, Elizabeth wouldn't have had a baseline to work from. He was the necessary radical. He pushed the pendulum so far to one side that when it finally swung back, it eventually settled in a place that allowed England to actually function without killing itself every Tuesday. The tragedy of Edward is that we remember him as a brief interruption, this pale, studious boy between the two great queens. But if you look at the psychological landscape of the Elizabethans, they're all obsessed with him. He was the lost king, the what if. They wrote poems about him as a phoenix. It's a bit ironic, isn't it? A boy who was so clinical, so cold and so detached became this symbol of national longing. Maybe it's because he was the last pure Tudor, the one who wasn't tainted by the messy, adult compromises of the later years. I often think about that leaden coffin in Westminster Abbey. It's tucked away in the Henry VII chapel, not far from his grandfather. For a long time, there wasn't even a proper monument, just a small stone. It's almost as if the country was a bit embarrassed by him, by his intensity, by his youth. We like our monarchs to be grand, bearded, and slightly terrifying, or wise and long-reigning. We don't really know what to do with a 15-year-old who died of a cough while trying to rewrite the soul of a nation. And Dudley? Well, Northumberland lost his head, obviously. He recanted his Protestantism on the scaffold, which must have made Edward spin in his grave. I was only joking about the gospel, really. Please don't kill me. It didn't work. The game of Tetris ended with a very real axe. It just goes to show that the paper rebellion only works as long as the person holding the pen is still breathing. In the archives, and there's this one letter, I think it's from a Venetian ambassador, who said that Edward was so remarkably well educated that he seemed like a miracle. But miracles don't last. They're flashes of light that leave you blinking in the dark. That was Edward. A flash of light that blinded the Catholics, energized the Protestants, and then left everyone stumbling around in the shadows of the mid-Tudor crisis. If he'd lived, God, the what-ifs are endless. A Protestant Inquisition, a war with Spain decades earlier, a marriage to a French princess that would have turned him into a different kind of man. We'll never know. We just have the journal, the maps, and the record of a great room that turned into a tragedy. He's a reminder that history isn't just made by great men. It's made by children who are forced to grow up too fast in rooms that are too cold. So, next time you see a portrait of a thin boy in a black doublet, with eyes that look like they've seen too much, and a hand resting on a dagger he never got to use, spare a thought for Edwayne Road. He wasn't just a placeholder. He was a force of nature that ran out of breath. He was the king who died at 15, and, in doing so, ensured that the England we know, for better or worse, actually came to be. Anyway, it's late. The rain has stopped here. I hope you've enjoyed this long wander through the corridors of a dying boy's palace.